Ladies and gentlemen, we are ready to begin. And anybody who's worried that only Mexico gets the brunt end of the tweets, the Brits are feeling pretty sore too. Ladies and gentlemen, this morning we are launching Charting a New Course, Policy Options for the Next Stage in U.S. Mexico Relations. This was an idea which we began at Woodrow Wilson to prepare early last summer, but the project was rewritten in November. So what you have here is a comprehensive approach to the relationship, to the issues which matter, with recommendations which I find nuanced and multiple. In other words, there's lots to choose from. We have a panel of 5 speakers, 2 of whom you have already met, but they will join us again. And I'm going to ask Andrew Seeley, the Vice President of Woodrow Wilson Center, to start us off with his contribution on immigration, since the audience has clearly indicated they would have liked more on immigration from the previous panel. So Andrew, I pass to you.
Thank you, Diana. Great pleasure to be here. Migration is a subject that in both countries generates enormous passions and sensitivities, as it should. I mean, it touches on the fiber of who we are in this country and who Mexicans are in their country. I'm going to try and be, however, as dispassionate about this as possible, as one can under current circumstances where passions run high on many sides, and just lay out 5 things that are in this that are in the proposal that we have for you today in the publication. The first one is just to say that trends have changed enormously. So point 1 is that we have seen enormous changes in the trends of migration. When we talked about migration in the past, Mexico was the leading country sending people to the United States as immigrants, both legally and illegally. That has changed. China and India actually have larger numbers. In fact, and this will be a surprise to many of us, there are actually more people coming to the United States from Asia now than from Latin America. There's been a shift in the past few years of this. In terms of unauthorized migration, the official term used by the U.S. government, we've seen a shift of Mexicans being the predominant number to Central Americans being the largest number in 2 of the last 3 years coming across the U.S. Mexico border. Okay, we actually have, both in 2014 and 2016, more Central Americans from 3 fairly small countries in the northern triangle of Central America who are a larger number than Mexicans coming across the U.S.-Mexican border. Mexicans have simply stopped coming in large numbers. This is rather surprising. It's a huge shift in what's going on. But also increasing what we're seeing is, we used to say that about 40% of people who were coming to this country without papers were coming across the U.S. Mexico. About 40% of the people were overstaying their visas. It's closer to 55 to 60% today. So increasingly, the emphasis, what is happening in terms of people coming without papers, is actually folks coming through airports, right, and through seaports, not across the U.S.-Mexico border. And those coming at the U.S.-Mexico border are increasingly not Mexicans, but people from Central America. This means we need to adapt our mental maps to a new reality, to a situation that is quantitatively differently and qualitatively different than what we were dealing with 10 years ago. And the stock of unauthorized Mexicans in the United States has also gone down. One of the things we're seeing is not only are fewer people coming, but more people are returning. And the Pew Research Center has done some very good work on this. We've seen a large number of people, both those who are legally in this country and those who aren't, returning to Mexico. We see actually a large number of people who are naturalized citizens, who are green card holders, as well as people who are unauthorized returning to Mexico. The actual stock of the unauthorized Mexican population has gone down by about 1 million in the past decade. This is simply to start off by saying, and then the final trend on this is that, we're seeing increasingly Americans moving to Mexico. And I occasionally say, and I can't actually substantiate this, but we're probably more Americans moving to Mexico than Mexicans to the United States. Again, I don't quote me on that because I can't actually substantiate that claim, but it's probably true. What we've seen is certainly the stock has increased of Americans in Mexico much faster at the time when the number of Mexicans has been stagnant, declining in terms of unauthorized and stagnant overall. So rather surprising changes. So that's number 1, is the trends have changed, and we really need to update our mental maps. That I know does not go well with the passions of the times on both sides of the border. But what it means for the United States is we need to look at broader questions than simply the border and broader questions than simply Mexico when we talk about unauthorized immigration, but also for Mexicans beginning to think of the country as a country of transit and a country of destination, especially for Americans. And that's a significant change in mental map in Mexico. Second point I want to say is that cooperation at the border is key. If a majority of people coming across, and this trend held at least until December, I've not actually checked it with the people that keep statistics at DHS more recently than that, but this was holding into part of this fiscal year, certainly. If increasing what we're dealing with are Central American flows, the cooperation between the U.S. and Mexico is critical on this. And this is something that is, a large question as this administration, as the Trump administration looks at what it wants to do, clearly has staked a claim to try and reduce unauthorized migration to the United States. But obviously, if the largest flow is from Central America at this point, cooperation with Mexico, which is detaining and removing more Central Americans than the United States, is going to be crucial. And anything that damages that collaboration is obviously going to go against the stated policy of the administration. And so the second point is beginning to think about how to address that cooperation, even if the goal is to reduce unauthorized immigration into the United States. Cooperation with Mexico is going to be essential to this. You cannot do it without Mexico. But also there's a lot of third-party flows, which Secretary Kelly has noted are of major concern. This is something he talked about a lot when he's at Southcom and in his hearings. In dealing with third-party flows, third-country flows from outside of Mexico across the border, including those that could be from countries where there are potential threats, cooperation with Mexico is crucial. And so, second point again, cooperation at the border is key. Third point I want to make is that it's important when we focus on the border not just to think about the points between the border ports of entry. And I think Chris Wilson will probably say something about this later. But, when we talk about what comes across, when we talk about building a wall, and I'm going to be agnostic on the wall here. We've heard various comments. You could probably guess my point of view on this. But there are reasons why one could argue for a border wall, or for at least increasing what we have in terms of physical barrier between the two countries. That is going to deal with immigration flows, and it's going to deal with some marijuana trafficking. But most of the major threats to the homeland come through ports of entry. Okay, if you're talking about concerns about bad hombres, to use a term that's been coined recently, about people trafficking heroin, cocaine, and methamphetamines, they're coming through ports of entry overwhelmingly, right? This is traffic that comes through in trucks and cars, hidden in shipments, that are coming across. Marijuana does tend to come through the desert, does tend to come through some between ports of entry. If we talk about terrorist threats, it's very unlikely that you're going to see someone running through the desert who wants to do harm to the United States. It's much more likely that were that to occur, and let's be honest, it is a real threat, and it's something that we need to be concerned about over the long term. They're likely to come in with a fake passport, and they're likely to do it at border points of entry. And when we've seen attempts to do this in the past that have been thwarted by cooperation and intelligence between the U.S. and Mexican governments, that is the MO, right? They're trying to get into the country through ports of entry. We need to give some serious attention to ports of entry. And we need to think about, continuing some of what we've done in terms of risk management, because you can't stop and search everyone coming through ports of entry. So how we do risk management in intelligent ways, and I have to say CBP has been incredibly creative, our neighbors across the way, in how do you begin to do this, segment different groups, different flows, so that we can look at those that are potentially dangerous or potentially harmful versus those that are much more routine. And we need to think in terms of cooperation in those ports of entry to maximize intelligence about what could actually do harm. The fourth point. So, again, as much as we think about the image that we have, again, mental maps is sort of people running through the desert, the reality is the great dangers actually come through in much more insidious ways in ports of entry. Fourth, we need to monitor and calibrate immigration enforcement policy in this country. President Trump has stated that his intention is to give priority to immigrants with unauthorized immigrants with a criminal record. I think that's something that most Americans would support. We could argue about what constitutes a criminal record and how recently and what gravity, but most people would see that as a starting point. It's a very reasonable approach. Some of what we've seen in terms of directives seem to increase discretionality and actually take us away from that. And I think that's something worth monitoring and looking at the numbers and seeing if they actually change. Are we moving towards the objective that we want? I think that's going to be a question that facts and figures are going to tell us a lot and probably need to be calibrated over time. I don't think we're going to see mass deportations happening tomorrow. I don't think There is the capacity in the U.S. government to do that. That's why prioritization matters. We will, however, over time probably see enhanced capacity. But that is going to take some time to build up, particularly for interior removals. It's going to take considerable time to bring on new agents if they're authorized in the budget, to train them and to get them out there. And so rather than looking at what is a, sort of mass deport, what both has been, people in the government have stated and people in the advocacy community have worried about, a sort of mass deportation, somewhere it's probably not going to happen. What is likely to happen in the short term is increased discretionality, which has its own set of issues. And in the long term, we might actually be looking at increased numbers. And finally, let me just say that though it's a subject we give very little attention to, we should pay attention to the number of Americans in Mexico, because we're talking officially, according to INEGI in Mexico, about 739,000 Americans living in Mexico. According to the State Department, we're talking about 1 million, and most of us sort of throw out 1 million because it's a nice round number. We don't really know what the answer is, but there are a lot of Americans living in Mexico. It's almost as many as in all of Europe. Okay, let that sink in. Almost as many Americans live in Mexico, one country, as in all of Europe. That is a really large number. Slightly more in Europe, but it is a very large number. Beginning to think now, we don't notice that because some of those people come and go, particularly retirees. Some of those people are culturally heritage Mexican, right? They are children or spouses of Mexicans who have returned, and they speak Spanish, and they know enough of the culture that they're able to somewhat fit in. But in reality, they're American. And if they're kids, they've often been raised in cities in the United States, and suddenly they're back in their parents' rural hometowns in Mexico, right? Very different environment. This is a community we need to actually begin to take seriously as Americans, and the Mexican government also. There's a lot of issues that people face as they move back in terms of recognition of studies, in terms of access to public benefits that are affecting Americans living in Mexico. And we have yet to really think of ourselves as an immigrant nation, and Mexico has yet to think of itself as an immigrant nation. But as we update our mental maps, in fact, what's happened is this relationship has changed dramatically, and we're still operating out of playbooks that are about a decade old. So thank you.
Andrew, thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for filling in an important part of our discussion this morning. Eric Olson, would you address the security situation?
Well, I'll try my best. Thank you, Diana. If you're like me, you've been sitting on the edge of your chair here for the last few weeks wondering when they're going to solve the great mystery of the missing football jersey from the Super Bowl. And I assume you all know that overnight the news broke that indeed the jersey was found, and that another was found, and yet another was found. The bad news, of course, is that they were found in Mexico, and you could say, oh no, more bad news. There'll be more tweets about this. But I think if you listen to the stories and read about it, it's actually kind of a good news story, right? I heard the chief of police of Houston this morning say that they worked very closely with Mexican authorities and got a great deal of cooperation in the investigation around this missing jersey. Of course, jerseys aren't that important in the grand scheme of things. I'm a Packers fan, so I can say that, but yay, Packers. Anyway, the truth of the matter is that despite the kind of overall uncertainty, the dark clouds, the fragility that our ambassadors talked about, that none of us expected at this moment, I would argue that there's actually tremendous amount of resilience that's been built up in this relationship over the last 10 years. And I don't know the specifics of the Jersey case, but I just suspect that there's a whole lot of Mexican police and authorities that were very eager to solve this problem. It's probably a little bit embarrassing to have it end up in Mexico, but there's an eagerness in the midst of all this uncertainty, in the midst of all these negativities. There's a desire and a resilience to that relationship that I think we need to sort of acknowledge. I don't mean to suggest in any way that this is not a serious moment, this is not even a risky moment, but I do want to underscore the strength that has built up over the last 10 years. Can it be wiped out? No question. But I think it's there, and I think people on the Mexican side, I think Amy this morning said, actually, in some ways, the adults in the room right now are the Mexicans, and I just want to acknowledge that despite insults and despite negativities, they are staying with it. And I, over the last few days, have tried to check in with colleagues and counterparts in Mexico and here in the United States to get a handle on where things lie, because I think it would be possible for, in this environment, for the Mexican military to pull back, for Mexican authorities to pull back in the kind of collaboration and cooperation that we've seen building over time. And I'm happy to report and say that in fact, most of what I've learned in the last couple of days is that resilience continues. No programs have been canceled. Nobody has said no more. People continue to exchange information, liaison officers, and collaboration. And I think that's an incredibly important statement. Will that continue indefinitely, no matter what happens in the United States? I don't think we could say that. And obviously, the clock is ticking in the context of Mexico's election period, and the political space may be closing down in terms of the ability of people to stand up and defend the importance of the relationship with the United States. But I think at this moment we seem to be in a place where people are willing to continue because they see it in the benefit of both countries. Mexico sees it as a benefit to it, and obviously the United States views it in the same light. A couple of points I want to make out of the paper, just as highlights and summaries. Obviously, I think in 2007, when the importance of what happened in 2007, when Presidents Bush and Calderon sat down finally in Mérida, Yucatan, and announced this Mérida initiative, I think what was really important was the establishment of this a framework of shared responsibility. And it may seem like a minor thing at this point, but really it fundamentally changed the dynamics between both countries when it came to security. And it was actually quite a bold, maybe even risky move to stand up and say we're going to work together solving a problem, as opposed to blaming the other side for the problem. And so I think that's got to be fundamentally at the core of this as we think about the security relationship. I think the second thing I try to argue in the paper is that we have to go beyond thinking in traditional terms about a security relationship. Oftentimes, security relationships are measured in terms of dollars and cents, numbers of airplanes, number of gadgets, numbers of training exercises that happen. But I think the strength of the relationship between the U.S. and Mexico can't be measured in terms of simple dollars and cents, because in actual fact, it's quite low when you compare the numbers between the United States and Mexico. We're talking about, in this year's budget, if it ever gets passed and finalized, probably in the neighborhood of $130 million. That pales in comparison when you think about U.S. assistance for the Northern Triangle of Central America, when you think about the trajectory of U.S. assistance in Colombia, much less other hotspots around the world. So the relationship is important, not simply because of the programmatic elements, those are important elements, but it's the bigger strategic framework, the ability to sit down together at high levels and look at new threats and think about new things that are impacting both countries. And I want to underscore that as well. People say, oh, it's such a little bit of money, this is unimportant, the U.S. doesn't care about Mexico. I think it does go much beyond that, and it's the ability to share intelligence, to share information, and work together on common problems that can't easily be measured in dollars and cents. Secondly, I would also point out to the real importance going forward of collaboration on the so-called southern border. And by that I don't mean the U.S. Mexico border, but I do mean Mexico's southern border with Guatemala. I think Andrew alluded to that. There's obviously a number of issues related to migration and the importance of of having a strong southern border between Guatemala and Mexico. Mexico conceives of that border as very important, but does not tend to think about it in the same way the United States thinks about its border. It's not in terms of building barriers and infrastructure, but they've tried to be much more strategic in their thinking about investment in the southern border between Guatemala and Mexico. There are many challenges there, there's no question. It's very remote, it's a very difficult terrain, but I do think there's a lot of important thinking going on that. And the United States needs to have a good working relationship with Mexico if its own concerns about that area are going to be taken into account. The U.S. can impose things, but the U.S. can support efforts to improve the security and the safety along that border, and I think it's immensely important. I do believe that now Secretary Kelly, who, as you all know, was the commander of SOUTHCOM and very personally interested in the Northern Triangle, invested SOUTHCOM resources in building up Guatemala's capacity, is well aware of the strategic importance of that southern border and is very well aware of the sensitivities in Mexico, and I think treads very carefully on those issues in the relationship with Mexico. So I have a few policy recommendations that I'll just touch on very briefly. They're discussed in more detail in the paper. But first and foremost, I think we need to reaffirm and preserve the framework of shared responsibility. That has to be the starting point for both sides. Next, I think we need to acknowledge the multiplicity of threats and factors contributing to insecurity in Mexico. It's too easy for the United States to reduce everything to simply the question of drug trafficking. Here I'm not saying drug trafficking is not important. Obviously it is. There are new challenges. Heroin trade, for one, is a new challenge. We now know that there's a bumper crop of coca leaf production in Colombia, a bumper crop of cocaine being proposed in that. Okay. And so I think it's important for the United States to be able to work strategically on a variety of challenges, not just the drug challenge. And one of those strategic challenges has to do with supporting and strengthening the capacity of Mexican institutions to deal with perennial problems of impunity, corruption, support for those efforts that can be bilateral. There's a lot of investigation that has happened on the U.S. part that supported efforts to prosecute corrupt officials in Mexico. And I think those are other elements of the relationship that need to be preserved and not overlooked by a narrow focus only on the drugs problem. So many other recommendations, but my time is up.
Thank you, Eric. Yes, the only answer is you've got to read Eric's chapter. I want to move now to opportunity, which is namely the energy portfolio, and our director of the Mexico Institute, Duncan Woods.
Thank you, Diana. Thank you very much, everybody, again, for being here. I started studying Mexican energy back in 2005, and around 2007, 2008, Andrew actually invited me to work with the Wilson Center on energy issues. And at that point, it was very much a niche enterprise, and we were looking for areas of collaboration between the two countries where, you know, we could find something that wasn't going to offend Mexican sensitivities. And so we focused on climate change issues, environment, renewable energy, things like that. And that was very much, actually, we don't need to have this up right now if we can take that down because it'll come up later on. I'll just ask to put that on later on. And we were looking at issues where we could actually come up with a meaningful conversation, but it was very, very niche. And at one point, we had a very engaging conversation here at the Wilson Center about cross-border transmission, but there was really no real sort of emphasis. So there was no sort of impulse behind it all. We weren't moving forward rapidly enough. And of course, all of that changed in 2013 with the energy reform. once that energy reform, that landmark reform had been passed in Mexico, there was the opportunity to open up an entire world of conversations about oil and gas, about electricity cooperation, and it changed everything. And we talk all the time about how it has changed Mexico, but in terms of the bilateral relationship, it changed it fundamentally as well. In 2014, in February, at the North American Leaders Summit in Toluca, Mexico, the three countries, Canada, Mexico, the United States, got together and they said, we are now going to create a North American energy dialogue. And a lot of us at the time said, well, what's that going to look like? Will the three energy ministers get on together? Will there actually be substance here? The agenda that they laid out was collaboration on the generation of North American energy data. That sounds kind of like a nerdy, boring thing. In fact, it was incredibly important that for the first time, the three countries began reporting their energy data in the same way. They started creating maps of where energy resources and where energy infrastructure was in North America. That was of enormous use, not just to nerds like myself who want to know where those things are, but also to industry to actually begin to sort of map out and to plan the future. They focused on responsible and sustainable best practices for the development of unconventional oil and gas, and then modern resilient energy infrastructure for North America. This rather ambitious agenda actually played through in an extraordinary way over the next few years, creating not just that dialogue where the energy ministers have got together every year, and of course their Sherpas have been talking in between, but also the fact that they have created a North American Cooperation on Energy Information Initiative, whereby they have common data online. And if you go to the website for this, it really is an incredible resource. You can look at a map of North America and see where every refinery is, where every transmission line is, where every natural gas pipeline is, et cetera, et cetera. And this is something which, for the first time, allows us to think about North America in a meaningful way in terms of energy. In 2015, the three countries produced a trilateral energy outlook, which was not supposed to say that they were going to be planning together or there was going to be common policy, but they finally had a shared vision of what North America actually looked like in terms of energy. And one thing I like to point out is that the very last agreement that I think was signed by Secretary Moniz as he was leaving government was actually a grid reliability agreement in Mexico City with Mexican regulators and with the energy ministry down there to emphasize how important bilateral cooperation actually is. And I've talked about energy so far, but let's also mention very quickly climate issues. Mexico and the United States were amongst the first countries to publish their INDCs ahead of the Paris Accord, which meant that they came together at Paris and worked very, very closely together to make sure that that agreement came through. In Ottawa last year, Mexico and the United States, along with Canada, signed a methane emissions reduction agreement, which is which projects an image of the future for North American energy, which is actually one which is much more efficient in terms of capping those leaks of methane gas from oil and gas installations. And lastly, the Kigali Agreement on hydrofluorocarbons, where the three countries came together and really provided a common approach to limiting the emissions of HFCs. So I think that what we've seen over the past 3 to 4 years is actually something which is extraordinary in historical perspective. And then we get to November of last year, and then we get to say, well, what are the priorities of the new administration? And a lot of us, I think, sort of sat there and thought, well, what's going to happen to that kind of agenda? And what I did when I was preparing my chapter for this book was to look at the priorities on energy policy that the Trump campaign had put forward, many of which have actually been played forward into the announcements that have been made on energy policy so far. And of course, we're still waiting to see what the Department of Energy really comes through with. But I think there are 4 main themes that we can see there that directly reflect priorities from the Trump campaign. The first of those is regulation. And of course, the Trump administration has announced that they have a mission to cut regulatory burden. And I would say that rather than deregulation, we're looking at efficient regulation. This is a priority not just for the United States, but it's clearly a priority in Mexico as well. When you speak to folks who actually live and work in the energy sector in Mexico, there is a regulatory burden there of excessive paperwork, duplication of processes that needs to be dealt with. And I see that given that there is a movement here in the United States to try to cut regulatory burden in the energy sector, this is something that can be the source of a very, very productive bilateral conversation. Second issue, the Trump campaign, of course, has focused a great deal on questions of infrastructure, including energy infrastructure. And a lot of that infrastructure is, of course, cross-border. So looking at natural gas pipelines, looking at electricity transmission lines, this needs to be planned out on a bilateral basis, and the two countries need to come together to talk about that. Third point that was emphasized by the Trump campaign was the question of friendly oil suppliers. Mexico is a fundamentally important oil supplier, but it's one that has been in decline in recent years because of the problems of the oil and gas sector. Hopefully, the energy reform of 2013 is turning that around. We will see new supplies coming online in the next couple of years. But it emphasizes the point that the United States should try to support Mexico in its energy reform as much as possible so that it can guarantee those supplies from a friendly country. And lastly, natural gas was a priority for the Trump energy platform. Mexico is the fastest growing natural gas market for American producers. It is estimated that in the next few years, exports to Mexico will reach between 8 to 10% of total U.S. production. Now, the energy price, or the price of natural gas right now, is very, very low. Imagine what it would be if you took away that very, very important market that is growing dramatically in Mexico. There is ample room for that market to grow, for the price to increase, but the last thing we want to happen is for it to drop even further. And that leads me to a supplementary point, which is that we think about Mexico as a source of energy, but Mexico is vitally important as an energy market for U.S. products. Think about natural gas, think about refined products, think about electricity trade, and the scope for growing that market. And I think this is one of the things that we don't speak about very much here in the United States. We talk about how Mexico supplies us with crude oil, but let's face it, in the past couple of years, Mexico's energy surplus with the United States has turned into an energy deficit. The United States itself has a surplus on selling goods, energy goods to Mexico. It's because refined products are in great demand in Mexico right now, and Mexico has not updated its refining infrastructure, and natural gas exports as well. In fact, we have something like a $6 billion surplus in energy exports to Mexico. That's something which hardly anybody ever talks about. I am grateful to all of the friends that I've been able to speak to. Like Eric mentioned, I made a lot of phone calls and had a lot of conversations leading up to this. The folks who are on our board, for example, and I'd like to give a shout out to ExxonMobil, Shell, Hunt, Pioneer, Noble, who helped me in trying to understand why Mexico matters. And one of the points that came through, which is actually not included in the published version, but I want to make a good point on right now, is that we all think about NAFTA as a trade agreement. But let's not forget that its investor protections are vitally important as well. A lot of the folks who have invested in Mexico, who have made commitments to invest in Mexico because of the energy reform, are worried that if we lost NAFTA, we would lose those investor protections. And that's something which puts a lot of money at risk, particularly given political uncertainties in the future. That's a point that I think we need to focus on a lot more. Rather than just talking about deficits, let's talk about the investment environment that has been created and enforced by NAFTA. Many thanks.
Duncan, thank you. We're not having any slides? No pictures?
There was one slide, and I completely forgot about it. It was the beautiful one of natural gas exports to Mexico. But we'll deal with that later.
I now want to call on Ambassador Gutierrez, his predecessor, Ambassador Arturo Sarucan, to give the perspective of Mexican... Well, 4 times. Some of them came and went pretty fast. To give the perspective of foreign policy. Now, I recall that when Ambassador Sarucan came here, Mexican foreign policy was EU policy with the United States. What's happening now?
Thank you, Diana. Good morning. It's great to be with so many colleagues and friends and so many in the audience that we've worked so many years to build a truly strategic bilateral relationship with the United States. It's good to see some of my George Washington University students in the crowd taking copious notes. They've got a midterm this afternoon, so I guess that's why they're taking lots of notes. Tony and I, there's a confession at the outset. Tony and I wrote this chapter on how Mexico and the United States could deepen their engagement on foreign policy issues and develop something that we believe is still a critically important piece of the puzzle, which is a North American foreign policy footprint, which includes Canada, despite the challenge in recent years to engage our Canadian friends on a number of regional and global issues, but we believe that this is a unique opportunity. And I must say that we started writing this chapter when the electoral landscape in this country looked pretty different from what it is today, and that some of the stuff that's in there, given what's happened in the past 2 months, may seem very Panglossian, but we still believe that this is a unique opportunity to continue building upon what has been achieved. And for you to understand why you're going to see some of the stuff that, some of the issues and some of the way that we've approached them in this chapter in the volume, I think it's always important to, I'm a historian by training, so I think history is always useful to understand where we came from and where we are, and to sort of understand why we think this is so important. Let me very, very quickly give you a sense of where the relationship has come from in the past 30 years and why this moment is so jarring and jolting. And given that we're talking about foreign policy, let me start by the nadir of the bilateral relationship in modern times. I'm not talking about the U.S. invasion in 1846, but in modern history, the nadir of the U.S. Mexico bilateral relationship was triggered precisely because of foreign policy. And it occurred in the 80s in Central America. And it is the only time, and it has never happened since, when the top foreign policy priority of Mexico, Central America, collided with one of the top 3 foreign policy priorities of the Reagan administration, which was Central America. And so suddenly you had 2 countries with 2 very different views of how to engage in Central America and what the Central American dynamics meant to the internal politics of the region, but also to the security of the region, clashing. To underscore how poisonous this was, I'm not going to name names, but you can very quickly figure out who they were. The then Secretary of State and the then Secretary of Foreign Relations of Mexico, to this day, cannot be in the same room as to how poisonous that dynamic was during the 80s. But then remember what happened immediately, sort of at that time. We had the abduction and murder of Enrique Camarena in Mexico. So a foreign policy issue that had nothing to do with a bilateral relationship gets torpedoed by a very complex issue in the bilateral relationship itself, the abduction and murder of a DA agent in Mexican soil, which completely scuttles the bilateral relationship. Now, what's very curious is that a few years later, we're already on the road to one of those 2 pivotal moments that changed the dynamic of the Mexico-U.S. bilateral relationship, which is obviously NAFTA, and how NAFTA changes the economic and trade dynamics between both countries, is then followed by the second pivotal moment in the relationship, which is 9/11. And you don't have to be a rocket scientist or Richelieu or Kissinger or Thucydides to understand why Mexico, right from the get-go, understood that in a post-9/11 world, if we didn't work hand in hand with our U.S. colleagues and friends to ensure that a terrorist threat did not materialize across the border from Mexico, the trade and economic relationship that we had been building would completely collapse. And so these 2 moments completely, profoundly transformed the bilateral relationship. Most of that has been reflected here in the specific chapters that some of my colleagues have, but also in the conversations that you heard between my dear colleagues, former U.S. ambassadors to Mexico, and in the first panel here this morning. All of this led the way to what I think was one of the most, for someone who has been a career diplomat and is now a recovering diplomat, who spent 23 years in the Foreign Service and who is a U.S. hand, having spent most of my career in the relationship with the United States, one of the most promising developments that occurred in the last decade was that this relationship started becoming much more than just a bilateral relationship. Eric talks about how the Media Initiative changed the paradigm and the scope of interaction and engagement between Mexico and the United States on the security front. But what is stunning is that the Media Initiative, in many ways, became a midwife of greater U.S. Mexican cooperation on the in the international arena, regionally and globally. And this trust and engagement that had been building started delivering results in ways that I think both countries would have never imagined 20 years ago, when both countries started talking about how do we deal with Iran and what do we do in Libya. And I know that at the time it sounded like Peter Sellers, for those of you who are too young to know who Inspector Clouseau or Peter Sellers or the Pink Panther movie was, just Google it this afternoon, but this was like an Inspector Clouseau plot. You had an Iranian national who contacted whom he thought was a CETAS operative in Mexico to conduct a terrorist hit on my Saudi colleague here in Washington, D.C., bombing Café Milano. In fact, when Secretary Videgaray and Secretary Guajardo were here last week to meet with White House officials, they had dinner that night at Café Milano with Secretary Ross. And I told both of them, you should have let me know that you were going to have dinner at Café Milano, because you should have told Wilbur Ross that they are, and then Rex Tillerson came into Café Milano. You should have told them both that they were having dinner at Café Milano because we worked with the United States to prevent the Al-Quds operation to bomb Café Milano. We also prevented one of the sons of, and I'm sharing this with you because it's all public record, we prevented one of the sons of Muammar Gaddafi after the fall of the Gaddafi regime in Libya from using a truly trilateral operation, using a U.S. charter plane with a Canadian operator and a Mexican pilot to bring him to golden exile in Puerto Vallarta, using a convoluted route of flying out from Libya through the Azores to the Bahamas, to Canada, and then to Cozumel, and from there to Puerto Vallarta. These types of engagements, where Mexico and the United States, yes, we were talking about confronting organized crime and ensuring border security, but we were also starting to think and engage in ways that you had never seen in this bilateral relationship, started changing the dynamics of how Mexico and the United States thought of how they cooperate on the global arena. And so in many ways, this chapter that Tony and I co-wrote is predicated on what could be the types of issues where Mexico and the United States, and where necessary, where the interests converge with Canada, can work to deepen that North American footprint. We think it is still germane to talk about this. I'm not going to lie to you. I know that there is a normal human tendency to normalize what is not normal, and there is a huge risk to the U.S. Mexico bilateral relationship at play at this given moment. Jerónimo said it this morning. Mexico is the country that's behaving like the adult in this relationship at huge domestic political costs. Remember that there's a Mexican government that has, because of approval ratings, a very small maneuverability to do stuff that maybe 2-3 years ago would have been tenable. And I'll give you an example which feeds not only into some of the chapters, into some of the conversation, but also to what Tony and I are trying to get at in this chapter, which is, for example, on immigration. Most of you will remember in 2012, the last year of the first Obama administration, the discussion over comprehensive immigration reform. The Gang of Eight is already working together, and there's this whole discussion over a touchback clause. The idea was, within the compartment of regularization of those 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States, for them to be able to legalize their status. We weren't talking about citizenship. It was how you legalize the status of 11 million people who are in this country without papers. And obviously the whole discussion on Capitol Hill was, They need to leave the United States and then come back legally to document and sort of establish a documented presence in the United States. And so the whole conversation, both on Capitol Hill and in the administration, was how do we do this? Because, you know, it's easy for 5 million Mexicans, of those 11 million undocumented, to cross the border into Mexico and then come back. But what do you do with Bangladeshis, Chinese, Indians, Irish, etc.? Just imagine how much this conversation has changed, that we back in 2012 were talking to the Obama administration about allowing these 11.5 million undocumented immigrants from crossing, all of them, into Mexico, getting documented in a U.S. consulate in 24, 48 hours on the Mexican side of the border, and then returning with a legal status to the United States. This today is impossible. It's not going to happen. Even more so because of the ambush of the Obama administration of, oh, we're going to send non-Mexican nationals across the border into Mexico. What has happened, and what's dangerous, and what can scupper a lot of what Tony and I have in this book, is that as a result of the positions that this administration has taken, Mexico has had to start putting red lines. And the moment you start putting red lines, that really constrains your ability to then later say, oh, you know, actually that red line wasn't that red. I know that it's happened elsewhere and at other moments in recent history in the city. But for Mexico to be able to erase those red lines that it's put on everything from working on migration flows, on security, on the wall, on tariffs and quotas, this is a very complex scenario. So I hope that we have the ability in the weeks and months to build upon the constructive agenda that I think this volume has put forward, and that particularly Tony and I, on the issue of how do these two countries, and then in partnership with our Canadian friends, work to engage on issues like emergency preparedness and emergency response in Central America, on climate change and energy security, on peacekeeping operations, on how do we continue to develop North American common domain awareness to ensure that North America is secure against the potential threats of terrorist organizations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Wayne, we had the opportunity of listening to you earlier, but there is a question which only you can answer. When you arrived in Mexico City, Enrique Peña Nieto had just been, well, it was shortly after. You arrive in Mexico City at a time when the Peña Nieto administration is reviewing the relationship. It is in a cold, frozen state. And you managed a time when relations from the Mexican side were not cozy with the United States. How did you manage through that period of review by the Mexicans, which resulted in a certain coolness?
Well, there was a slight timing difference. I arrived over a year before the change of administrations. There was a moment of tension in that it was a surprise that I replaced the gentleman who was there before me, but it was actually with President Calderon, and so I worked with Arturo and President Calderon for a little over a year in that period of time. And we worked a lot on the Merida Initiative. That was actually the focus of what we were doing in those first months there, to actually deliver on the Merida Initiative, because it was a real change in the way we thought about things, but we actually needed to deliver the assistance and the equipment that we'd promised. And so we spent the first 6 months working on that and solidifying that. And then we did come into an election period, and at the end of 2012, the change of administrations in Mexico. And I think it was fair to say that when the new Mexican administration came in, they were astonished at the changes that had taken place since 2000 in the intimacy of the cooperation between the two governments. Just to go back a minute to Arturo's point of view, when Arturo talked about the 1980s, I happened to be working for the two secretaries of state who did not get along well with their Mexican counterpart and sat in many meetings hearing people rail about the Mexicans. The sort of, just let me add, the intermediary shifts were really the NAFTA negotiation, then the peso crisis, then 9/11, and then Merida, and then more recently reestablishing a broad set of interagency cooperation in security, building on Merida, both in the defense area, but then also bringing all agencies together, and the high-level economic dialogue, which brought together all the economic agencies again, as they had tried in the early 1990s, to really work things through. What that points out in this relationship is that it is both domestic and international, intramestic at the same time. And that's why when you read through our chapter about common foreign policy footprints, you're going to see that it's talking about all these things because they're all interwoven. Foreign policy and domestic policy for both Mexico and the United States overlap tremendously. And that's why at our embassy and in the bilateral relationship in the as we work on it, we have practically every agency in the U.S. government that's involved. And that's a similar thing on the Mexican side. And even those agencies that you think, well, they're mainly domestic, Homeland Security is the perfect example. Well, it's not domestic if you're talking about how do you extend out security as far as you can, and with a goal that all the North American countries are working to extend their security alert system as far as they can so bad people don't come in, whether they be terrorists or radicals of another ilk or criminals and international criminal networks. This is really a relationship that stretches extremely far. We actually started working much more closely on international economic issues long before we got to a position where we're working closely on foreign policy issues. But as Arturo said very eloquently, we have gotten there. We started having dialogues in the 2000s on all sorts of issues around the world where Mexico hadn't played a role before. Mexico started, it's really important to know, Mexico started saying, gee, we can have an international role. We can be a constructive player in a different way than traditionally we did. And many of you who know Mexican foreign policy know that precisely they often walled off whatever was happening in another country, that we weren't going to say something about that. Well, they started talking about what was happening in other countries when democratic values were in fact being violated. And that was a Mexican evolution, but it opened the door for having different kind of conversations with the United States. So what we lay out here is, in this book, in this chapter, is where we could go with this. And that's everything. One example, looking at international drug policy. We know there's a big drug challenge between the two countries, but it's not just between the two countries. A lot of those drugs come from South America. What's the right way to deal with drug challenges in this day and age? Should we take another look at it? Should we talk it through? Should we work with other countries? We mentioned those kind of issues. So there's a lot that's possible and that can be done. And indeed, as I mentioned earlier, the worry, one of my big worries, is that we're endangering the reality of this cooperation, but the potential for this cooperation right now.
its own citizens. So I think there has been a robust conversation between the Mexican government and Mexican migrant organizations. We have a couple colleagues here actually who lead a couple of the biggest organizations in the country who are with us today, about what should be done to make sure people know what their rights are and how they plan in case they are removed from the country. This is a major issue. And what the Mexican government can do to support their co-nationals in terms of any sort of legal protections that they can avail themselves of. In inverse, obviously, we've done less of this with U.S. populations in Mexico because there is less fear of removal. I think it is a robust conversation. There is yet perhaps less action on that front than there could be from the Mexican government, but I think it is going to be a big question. And I think the Mexican government has taken the right position on this, which is that, immigration policy is ultimately the province of each sovereign country. Mexico can opine about what the U.S. does, but what governments can do is protect their own citizens and make sure that they do have due process and look out to inform them and partner with them in any way that they can to make it less onerous. But right now, we don't have a bilateral conversation on migration, and frankly, I don't think that's coming back in the next 4 years.
Andrew, thank you. Eric, since you completed your chapter, the New York Times came out last Thursday, March 16, with an article which was highly critical of the rule of law in Mexico. How would you respond?
Well, I think the article was trying to make the case that there's been a somewhat of a counter reaction to the reforms. For those of you who don't follow it that much, over the last eight and a half years, Mexico's been transitioning its justice system to one that's we would call an adversarial system with more oral trials, more open examination of evidence and arguments before a judge, a neutral judge. These are really profound transformations in Mexico, led by Mexico, put in place, started by President Calderon in 2008. And I think this has been a slow and difficult process because it means a transformation of the rule of law culture in Mexico. But there's been political will to see that happen. Now, I think that article was referring to sort of a counter-reaction to that. Some people view this as, inefficient process. They perceive that people are getting off scot-free. The fact of the matter is that when President Calderon announced these reform packages that were even actually attempted by President Fox before him, there was an acknowledgement that the justice system in Mexico had a lot of problems, that impunity was a very difficult issue, and it was undermining the effectiveness of Mexico's institutions and capacity to take on criminal organizations. I think the United States has decided strategically, I think it's there in the budget breakdown, to support that process as a very important element of its strategy to fight criminal organizations in Mexico. It's been very much U.S. support for Mexico's initiatives in this regard. There are going to always be pushbacks when you're trying to change a culture, especially a rule of law culture in any country. It's not unique to Mexico. And I think that the U.S., until today, seems to continue to be committed in that direction, as does the Peña Nieto government and people generally in Mexico. But, things can change as well.
Eric, thank you. Duncan, what happens to the reformed energy sector if the border adjustment tax goes into effect, whether it be 35% or 17%, whatever that, what's the impact on Mexican energy?
I don't know. Let's be honest. So the first thing I think we find is that energy has been, oil and gas in particular, have been excluded from tariffs up to this point. I fully expect that would be the case, particularly because the energy sector here in the United States would make a very big stink about the possibility of retaliation on the Mexican side. Given the fact that electricity and hydrocarbons are such a fundamental element in the mix of production on both sides of the border, it would be highly disruptive. And I think that you would find that there would be an immediate and strident backlash against it. But let's just say, let's play it forward. What would happen? So if you started to raise the price of energy imports by 20 to 35%, whatever it is, then part of that cost will be transferred on to the consumer. And of course, there is the question that has been raised about currency depreciation that would occur after border adjustment tax that would kind of even it out. But remember that oil and gas are priced in dollars. And so the dollar price of oil imports from Mexico would go up. And of course, vice versa, the price of, if there was retaliation, the price of refined products going south would go up as well. That would be enormously disruptive to the economy. It would raise not just the cost of energy, but of course the cost of production. So that's something that obviously we want to avoid as much as possible.
One last question, and then it's up to you. Ambassador Sarukan, were the Mexican government to feel sufficiently irritated by tweets from Washington, is it serious to consider that the management of Central American migration flows through Mexico would change? Maybe more would move north?
With this government or the previous government, I think there's a full-fledged understanding in Mexico that the statu quo ante of Mexico's ability to ensure operational control of its southern border is a challenge and has to be addressed, whether it's from the customs standpoint. I was telling someone yesterday at the IMF, we had a session on what would happen with NAFTA and what the scenarios for a potential NAFTA negotiation could look like. They're obviously factoring this into their spring meeting, which is around the corner. And I was mentioning you've got a brand new bridge on the Guatemala-Mexico border, and right next to it, in the river, you've got inner tubes being used to ferry merchandise, and it's not even bad stuff. It's food and gasoline and toilet paper. There's a parallel customs operation right below the formal bridge and the SAT authorities on the Mexican side of the border. So there is a huge challenge of how do you ensure greater operational control and security on your border. What is evident, and I think the Mexican government has already suggested this and pointed to this, and I think is that all issues are on the table. And I pause there for a second because for those of you who haven't been in the thick of the U.S. Mexico relationship for many, many years, those of us who've dedicated most of our lives to the U.S. Mexico bilateral relationship there was a mantra previous to the joint responsibility or shared responsibility paradigm, which was critically important for decades, and which was the non-contamination of the agenda by disputes in specific areas of the relationship. That is, if we had a trade dispute on sugar, we wouldn't bring tomatoes into the equation, let alone security or water resources on the border. Why? Because this bilateral relationship was so complex and had so many moving parts that if you contaminated it with other issues that had nothing to do with the bilateral dispute, the relationship in and of itself would stall and not move forward. What, after a lot of badgering, this administration has finally done is said, we are linking every single issue of the bilateral relationship to the Trump administration wants to negotiate NAFTA, border wall, paid by Mexico, and immigration. And Mexico said, fine, but we're going to put every single other issue on the table. Why? Again, you don't have to be Richelieu to figure this one out. It's the only way where we can level the playing field in a still asymmetrical power relationship between two neighbors. It is by putting all the other issues, security and water and energy and transmigration, that Mexico has a bit more of leverage in its negotiation with the United States. So the Mexican government, to your question, has already signaled that it would be revising and reviewing policies that it has implemented for the past years, whether it's on security and the way we confront organized crime, or the types of policies that have been implemented at a very steep domestic cost in Mexico when it comes to how Mexico is detaining and repatriating Central American migrants without even giving them the right to an asylum hearing. So this would certainly be one of the first issues that I think the Mexican government may put on the table and said, you know, this is an open-ended negotiation, and we're going to review and maybe even revisit some of the policies that have been taken for granted by this administration.
Ambassador Wayne, I asked you a question previously, so you'll allow me now to turn to the audience. I'd like to take 2 or 3 questions together, and if you could identify whom you are talking to, we'll do it. Denise. Please identify yourself, particularly when you visit us so specially from Mexico City.
Good morning, Denise Dresser, Mexican political analyst and political scientist, a friend of the Wilson Center for many years. I have 2 questions, one for Arturo Sarucán and the other one for Duncan Wood. Arturo, you said, and this is true, that the Mexican government has been forced to draw red lines. But this was only after months of drawing pink lines or not drawing lines at all. And I understand the difficulty of any country dealing with the Trump administration that just does not seem to have a foreign policy at all, let alone a policy towards Mexico that goes
Question, please?
Yes. Yeah. No. The question is the following: what is the Mexican government doing wrong in terms of its relationship with the U.S. right now? What is it doing right, and what could it do better? And very quickly, this negotiating and package is going to be very hard to do because NAFTA negotiations are not going to happen for, I don't know, months. And at the same time, deportations, the wall is being built, all that is all that is happening. So how do you negotiate in package when the U.S. is already unilaterally making moves in the areas that you think you have leverage on? So those 2 questions. And for Duncan,
Denise, in order for others in the audience, and we have about 120 people here, I'm going to ask you just to keep to that one question.
Okay.
There is a gentleman up there, yes.
Duncan can have the question instead of mine.
Hi, my name is Eugenio Weigen. I work at the Center for American Progress, and my question is for Eric. You mentioned that there are other issues besides drugs in the security agenda, and one of them is gun trafficking, and that has been recognized by President Trump and, of course, in Mexico now. And I was wondering if you had further thoughts of what can be done bilaterally, unilaterally on that issue in particular.
Those 2 questions.
I will not commit the sin of former Mexican presidents of having my tongue work faster than my brain. There are certainly things that the current Mexican administration has done that did not help its position in the relationship with the United States. Number one, I think there is a page torn out of the old PRI book where the relationship with the United States is sort of keep it close on the economic front, but as distant as you can on any other front, and particularly on the security front, which may explain the type of reaction that Tony found when the new administration came into office and decided to sort of basically freeze the security collaboration that we had implemented for 6 years. And therefore, sometimes the nuances of understanding the triggers of the relationship, of what makes the United States tick, have been missing at different moments. And I think you saw that plainly and painfully during the campaign when then candidate Trump was given a press conference in Mexico City. Not having an ambassador for 6 or 7 months in Washington, D.C. Was a big challenge because it was a very delicate moment, and it was the morphing of the Trump candidacy and the sort of initial phases of a campaign, and not having someone on the ground here to be able to understand it and convey it adequately back home was also a challenge. I think that there was a very big mistake made in the run-up to the general campaign by publicly and I will, my piece to my bi-weekly column in the Universal tomorrow says this. I think there was a mistake made by publicly talking about convincing Mexicans in the United States that had a right to become U.S. citizens to do so with an electoral spin to it. If you look at what has happened in the Netherlands and in Germany over the way the Turkish government has mobilized its diaspora, both to support it in the aftermath of the coup and now to support the referendum that will give the Turkish president greater political powers, there's been a huge backlash in two very tolerant and open societies like the Dutch and the German, feeling that there are antagonistic nationalities at play, and in many ways remind me of what happened when another Mexican government also made a very big mistake in 2006, when the immigration reform bill was being discussed in Washington, when they enticed, pushed, convinced our Mexican communities in LA to demonstrate in favor of the immigration reform flying Mexican flags. So I think the Mexican government did a very bad mistake in precisely the moment where Trump was gaining speed of publicly talking about citizenship as a political electoral tool to push back. You do that under the radar screen. You don't use a setting like this, in which this was discussed, to talk about these issues. Now, having said this, I think the Mexican government has been, as the administration has come into office, I think there were a couple of missteps there, but I think that they quickly understood that they had to think strategically. The time could be one of their best allies. It's an ally, but it's also dangerous. For example, on NAFTA, there are many who believe that the longer the negotiation takes, the better, because it could dilute some of the yes, but at the same time, it may provoke President Trump to push the nuclear button of Article 2205 in NAFTA, because if he sees no movement in delivering his campaign promise of having renegotiated NAFTA, he may be tempted to say, screw this, I'm pulling the U.S. out of NAFTA. So even having said that, I think the Mexican government is carefully moving its pieces. I think it was very important for it to start laying red lines, as it has done in the past weeks, both for domestic but also bilateral reasons. I think that at the end of the day, the Mexican government has understood, contrary to Trump, that in Godfather Mario Puzo terms, this is business and it's not personal. And therefore they have to engage with a strategic vision. It is true that it will be hard to play the card of the coupled agenda items, not only because of the time frame of when NAFTA may be negotiated. We're now looking at maybe, depending on when the U.S. administration notifies Congress of the 90-day consultation period, but we're looking at maybe earliest August for the negotiations to start. And there's also another added problem, which is, because of what my colleagues here in the previous panel have said, every single agency in Washington, D.C. has an agenda with Mexico. And the fact that you don't have the deputy secretaries, the undersecretaries, and the assistant secretaries in each one of those departments, the ones that do the day-to-day engagement of the relationship with Mexico, makes it very hard to sit down and talk about a whole-of-government agenda. That's why regardless of the Twitter ambush of President Trump, it was a mistake to have brought President Peña Nieto so early on when you didn't have the counterparts to sit down and talk about a whole of government agenda.
There he goes.
Up, and I just wanted to point out that it was an issue that I touched on the paper. I think I can say briefly, I mean, there's a lot of complexities to this issue and things that could be done. I think the honest reality is that the political space for doing it has been much reduced, especially in light of the, as we all remember, the infamous Fast and Furious incident and debacle. Talk about a low point in U.S. Mexican relations for mistakes made by the United States. I think that was clearly one we could show to. So without putting forward things that can never happen, I would just say two things. One, I think we need to say it's an actual issue that needs to be dealt with. And I think there's been some fear and pulling back on both sides on this issue. So put it on the agenda. And secondly, elevate it a bit with more interagency working groups. There are things going on continually in terms of tracing and data of firearms that are confiscated by the Mexican authorities. But I think we can do more and be more creative and should push the envelope a little bit more. And let me just throw in one little factoid here. The research on violence shows that in many places, violence can be reduced enormously when firearms are carefully regulated and the links between firearms and alcohol are dealt with in a very specific way. We had here just a couple weeks ago former mayor of Cali, Colombia, one of the most violent cities in the world, and he brought the homicide rate down not because they put the Cali cartel in jail, but because they dealt with firearms and alcohol as an issue in their city and dramatically reduced homicides. So I'm not saying it's one or the other, but I do think it needs to be on the agenda. We should take it more seriously. It's a heavy lift for the United States. We all understand that. But we need to ask more of ourselves on this. Trafficking of firearms into Mexico is a serious problem and should be addressed at some level.
Eric, thank you very much. To those who wish to give a question, I've got to ask you to hold your question for the last panel. We're running 15 minutes late, and I'm going to ask everybody here and those in the overlap room to thank our 5 panelists with a round of applause.